In the heart of the American South, history often paints a picture of slavery as a world dominated by powerful men. Men who bought, sold, and controlled the lives of millions. But hidden within that story is a truth far less acknowledged, a truth that complicates everything we think we know. Nearly 40% of those who owned enslaved people were not men at all. They were women, white women, who found in ownership a sense of identity, influence, and power in a society that otherwise limited their voices. Imagine a young woman in the 19th century, raised in a household where she herself had little legal freedom. When she married, her husband became the head of the household, the one who managed finances, property, and public life. But inside that home, she discovered a different kind of authority, an authority that came not through voting or politics, but through control of human beings. Parents often gave their daughters enslaved people as gifts, more often than land or money. These gifts were not just servants, they were symbols of wealth, social rank, and security. For many white women, enslaved people became the foundation upon which they built their place in society. This story matters because it challenges the image of white women as innocent bystanders, quietly enduring life in a male-dominated culture. Instead, it reveals how they too participated in and benefited from a brutal system. Some used their enslaved workers to demonstrate status, others relied on them for economic survival, and many treated them with shocking cruelty. What's clear is that these women were not passive. They were deeply involved, shaping lives, families, and communities in ways that echo long beyond their own time. As we open this chapter, I invite you to think about what this says about power, how it's created, how it's maintained, and how it's used. Power is not always about who speaks loudest in the public square, sometimes it is about the quiet, calculated decisions made inside homes and behind closed doors. These choices tell us more about the society of the past than polished histories ever could. If this story surprises you, if it makes you want to learn more about the hidden sides of history, then stay with us. We are going to uncover difficult truths, explore real stories, and ask hard questions about how the past continues to shape the present. And if you want to keep exploring with us, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next untold story. Together, we can bring history out of the shadows and into the light. In the plantations and towns of the 19th century South, the passage from girlhood to womanhood carried rituals that spoke volumes about power, inheritance, and identity. For daughters of wealthy families, their coming of age was not marked only by dresses, jewelry, or the promise of marriage. Instead, a far more consequential gift often arrived, a gift that revealed what society valued most for them. It was not land, not titles, and not even wealth in coins. It was human lives, handed over as property. This tradition was not accidental. Land was risky, bound up in disputes, debts, and taxes. Sons were expected to inherit land to continue the family name and legacy in the public eye. But daughters were placed in a different role, one tied to the household and the private world of family life. For them, enslaved people became the currency of identity. The more they received, the more secure their future was said to be. In this way, society measured a young woman's worth not by her voice, her ambitions, or her learning, but by how many lives she could command. Picture a young girl at 13, sitting in the parlor with her parents. She has just crossed the threshold from childhood into a stage where she is expected to begin learning how to manage a household. On her birthday, her mother hands her a set of keys. They do not open jewelry boxes or treasure chests, but storage rooms, pantries, and work areas. Alongside those keys, her father announces that she now has help of her own, people who will serve her, answer to her, and remind her of the power she holds. From that day forward, she is no longer just a daughter, she is a mistress in training. The transition was subtle, but powerful. Each task she assigned, each order she gave, each punishment she witnessed, was part of her education. It was through this practice that young women learned how authority was exercised in their world. They did not inherit land to plow or manage, but they inherited bodies and lives to direct. Land could be lost to poor harvests, floods, or disputes. But control over people, especially within the home, was far more intimate, and far more enduring. As these girls grew older and married, the pattern continued. While husbands might claim the legal rights to property and land, wives often held on to what had been gifted to them. In a marriage where their legal voice was small, this became one of the only sources of independence they could claim. A woman might not speak in courts or vote in elections, but she could build her identity on the people she commanded each day. The enslaved individuals given to her in youth followed her into adulthood, and their labor, their lives, became the backbone of her household influence. The gifts also carried a symbolic weight in the community. Visitors could see a woman's importance not by what she wore or by her father's name alone, but by how many workers moved silently at her command. Her standing was measured in the breadth of her control, a quiet but unmistakable form of status that shaped how others saw her. It was not just about wealth, it was about the performance of authority, the visible reminder that she belonged to a class that ruled. But beneath this tradition lay something darker, an early and intentional shaping of the next generation. By gifting daughters people rather than property, parents ensured that their children would internalize a system where control over lives was normal, expected, even celebrated. It was a lesson written into the milestones of their lives. Birthdays, marriages, and family gatherings reinforced that their identity rested on dominance, not on partnership or creation. For the women themselves, this arrangement created a paradox. In a society that denied them equal power in the public world, they found authority in the private one. Their role was not passive. They were trained from youth to understand that control was theirs to exercise, and they carried that understanding with them into adulthood. The inheritance they received was not just a transfer of wealth, it was a transfer of worldview, a shaping of how power should be lived and displayed. This practice left a long shadow. It ensured that women were not merely companions to men in maintaining a system of inequality, they were active participants, molded for the role from the earliest years of their lives. Their sense of self, their reputation, and their daily routines became intertwined with the lives they held in their grasp. And so, generation after generation, the tradition continued, binding family honor and female identity to the ownership of human lives rather than to land or fortune. When we step back and see this story clearly, it forces us to reconsider the past. The choices parents made in gifting their daughters shaped not only households, but entire communities. They created a culture where young women grew up learning that their value did not rest in their minds, their voices, or their dreams, but in how many others lived under their command. That legacy, once so ordinary to them, now stands as one of history's most haunting lessons about how power can be taught, inherited, and passed down like a family treasure. From the earliest days of childhood, lessons were quietly woven into the lives of young white girls in the American South. Before they could even read or write, before they could understand the complexities of marriage or inheritance, they were already being shaped into a role that society had prepared for them. Their toys, their play, even the way adults spoke to them, all of it reinforced one idea: their lives would be defined by control over others. In nurseries and playrooms, dolls were not always made of porcelain or cloth. Sometimes, the playthings placed into little hands were miniature tools of household authority, tiny brooms, little sets of keys, and even mock ledgers that imitated the records their mothers kept. More telling still, some of their earliest playmates were not other children, but young boys and girls who lived in bondage. These children were not invited to play as equals. Instead, they were assigned roles of servitude even in the games of youth. To the young girls, it seemed natural, ordinary. To the society around them, it was deliberate training. By the time these girls were 5 or 6 years old, they had already absorbed countless unspoken lessons. When meals were served, they saw who brought the dishes and who sat at the table. When clothing needed mending or washing, they saw who labored and who commanded. Each observation etched into their minds the lines of authority, until those lines seemed as permanent as the walls of their homes. What they were really learning was not just how to live in their world, but how to rule within it. Mothers and grandmothers often played central roles in this education. They did not wait for daughters to become adults to explain the expectations of womanhood. Instead, instruction began with simple phrases: tell her what to do, or show him where to go. At first, it may have seemed like harmless guidance, a way to help a child grow confident. Yet beneath these words lay a deeper purpose: to instill habits of command, habits that blurred the line between authority and cruelty. The little girl who was praised for giving orders at 7 years old would one day be expected to give those same orders with finality at 20. Stories of childhood reveal that discipline was often part of this training as well. If an enslaved child failed to follow directions during play, parents sometimes encouraged their daughters to correct them. What might appear, in modern eyes, as an ordinary squabble between children became in that setting a rehearsal for dominance. The message was clear: authority was not to be questioned, even in the smallest moments. As these girls grew older, their education deepened. They watched their mothers manage entire households, coordinating work in kitchens, fields, and laundry rooms. They saw punishments handed down, meals rationed, and schedules enforced. While their brothers were taught the mechanics of trade, politics, or agriculture, daughters were taught the mechanics of control within the home. Both were forms of power, though one operated publicly and the other privately. This upbringing created a world where cruelty could be masked as normalcy. To these young girls, authority was not just permitted, it was celebrated. They were applauded when they managed others effectively, just as they were complimented for embroidery or music. Authority became part of their accomplishments, part of the skills that would make them successful women in the eyes of their community. It was as natural to their identities as learning to sew, host, or smile at gatherings. The consequences of this early training were profound. By the time a young woman entered adulthood, she no longer needed instruction on how to command; she had been practicing her entire life. What might shock outsiders was, to her, simply the world as she had always known it. Her sense of self was tied to how well she directed those under her, how confidently she could demand obedience, and how smoothly she could manage the rhythms of a household built on unequal power. And so, the cycle repeated. Each generation of girls grew up watching, learning, and rehearsing the same roles their mothers had once played. They inherited not only the possessions and customs of their families but also a worldview, one that equated authority with identity. By the time they became women, the lessons of childhood were no longer lessons at all, they were instincts, guiding every decision, every command, every response to defiance. When we look back, what stands out is not just the cruelty itself, but the deliberate way it was taught. It was not accidental. It was structured, reinforced, and normalized from infancy. The society of the time understood that power had to be cultivated early, so it shaped its daughters accordingly. What began with dolls, games, and nursery lessons ended with full participation in a system that defined lives, families, and communities for generations. This is the hidden story of childhood in the South, not simply one of innocence, but one where innocence was molded into authority. A girl's laughter in a playroom could be the echo of future commands. Her first lessons in responsibility were not about kindness or cooperation, but about hierarchy and control. And from those beginnings, entire lifetimes of power were built. In the legal world of the 19th century South, marriage was supposed to strip women of independence. The moment a woman said her vows, the law declared her husband the master of her property, her earnings, even her future. A wife could not sign contracts, manage her own wealth, or make decisions outside the shadow of her husband's authority. On paper, she was absorbed into his identity. Yet beneath the surface, women found ways to bend and reshape these restrictions, crafting quiet avenues of power that allowed them to hold on to what mattered most. One of the most striking examples of this ingenuity came in the form of ownership. Land and money were the most obvious symbols of wealth, but they were not always easy for women to protect. Husbands could sell property, squander fortunes, or fall into debt, leaving wives with little to show for their inheritance. So families turned to a different strategy. They created trusts and separate estates, legal arrangements that acted like hidden safes, protecting certain possessions from being swallowed by marriage. Through these tools, a daughter might enter her wedding not empty-handed but with assets preserved in her name alone. These were not trinkets or jewelry but living, breathing resources that generated labor and income. With a carefully crafted trust, a father could ensure that his daughter's inheritance remained hers no matter what choices her husband made. Creditors could not touch it, reckless decisions could not erase it, and even a domineering spouse could not take it away. What this meant in practice was that women retained a degree of authority far greater than the law otherwise permitted. While their husbands handled crops, debts, and politics, wives could manage their own estates within the legal shield of a trust. It gave them leverage in marriages where they were expected to be silent. Behind the scenes, some wives controlled wealth more securely than their husbands, and they knew it. Court records from the era reveal how fiercely women defended these arrangements. They filed petitions, battled in chancery courts, and cited the language of their trusts to prove that their assets were untouchable. Judges, bound by the wording of contracts, often agreed. And so, within a society that denied women the right to vote, sit on juries, or hold office, they carved out a private space of financial independence. It was a subtle rebellion, a quiet assertion that marriage would not erase their autonomy entirely. The cultural impact of this cannot be overstated. For many women, their sense of security and social identity was tied to these preserved holdings. They could host gatherings, manage households, and sustain their families with resources that were theirs alone. This control offered not just wealth but stability. A woman whose inheritance remained intact could weather her husband's failings, plan for her children's futures, and ensure that her name carried weight in her community. Yet what makes the story especially complex is how deliberate these strategies were. Parents, particularly fathers, understood the risks their daughters faced. They had seen fortunes vanish into the hands of irresponsible sons-in-law. They had watched debts consume family estates. So they acted with foresight, writing detailed agreements that ensured daughters would not be left powerless. In doing so, they created a paradox. While society preached that women were fragile dependents, the law quietly recognized them as capable custodians of wealth, when contracts demanded it. These trusts and estates also reshaped relationships within marriages. A husband might carry the title of head of household, but if his wife held wealth beyond his reach, the balance of power shifted. She could negotiate, withhold, or provide support on her own terms. In some cases, she became the more stable partner, her assets carrying the household through financial storms that her husband's ventures could not survive. The practice spread widely enough that it became almost expected among elite families. Daughters did not simply receive inheritances, they received carefully shielded inheritances. The legal system, so often stacked against women, became a tool they could manipulate to carve out agency. It was not open defiance but calculated maneuvering, a way of playing within the rules while subtly rewriting them. Looking back, these stories challenge the image of Southern women as powerless figures trapped by law and custom. They were constrained, yes, but they were also resourceful. They knew how to read between the lines of legal codes, how to use documents and signatures to protect what was theirs. While society denied them political voices, they found economic voices in the margins of the law. This hidden history reveals how even in a world designed to silence them, women found ways to assert themselves. They were not merely passengers carried along by their husbands' decisions. Through trusts and estates, they claimed a measure of control that endured through generations. In doing so, they reshaped family dynamics, preserved wealth, and carved out spaces of influence in a society that insisted they had none. It is a reminder that power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it hides in the fine print of legal documents, in the careful planning of parents, in the quiet resilience of wives who refuse to be erased by marriage. And sometimes, it is precisely these hidden strategies that reveal the most about how people survived, adapted, and resisted within the confines of their time. In the world of the 19th century South, buying and selling was more than a matter of business, it was a way of signaling status, forging connections, and shaping futures. And while men are often pictured as the ones standing at auctions or negotiating deals, the reality was more complex. White women, often assumed to be removed from such transactions, were in fact active participants. They bought, sold, and traded human lives with the same decisiveness that others might purchase land or livestock. Sometimes the dealings took place in public markets, but often, they were carried out in quieter, more personal settings, inside parlors, at kitchen tables, or through whispered arrangements within their social circles. Imagine a woman, seated in her home, discussing her household needs with a neighbor or a relative. Over tea, the conversation might shift from family updates to the subject of labor. Names would be mentioned, prices considered, terms debated. These transactions did not always require a bustling market or a courthouse ledger. A home could just as easily serve as a marketplace, where the exchange of laborers was woven into the fabric of everyday social life. Friendships and family ties became conduits for deals, with women using their networks to acquire or part with individuals according to the shifting demands of their households. For many women, these exchanges were not incidental, they were deliberate acts of management. Running a household in the South was more than supervising meals or mending clothes, it was overseeing a system of labor that touched every corner of daily life. When needs changed, when debts pressed, or when opportunities arose, women stepped into the role of negotiators. They might arrange a sale to ease financial strain, or seek to acquire someone whose skills promised greater comfort or efficiency at home. What makes these stories striking is the level of agency they reveal. At a time when women were denied the right to vote or hold office, their influence in the marketplace was real and tangible. A woman's reputation could grow from her skill in managing resources, and her ability to buy or sell strategically was a mark of competence. Letters, diaries, and account books from the period show women tracking transactions, weighing options, and taking pride in their decisions. These records illuminate how deeply embedded they were in the economic rhythms of their world. The transactions themselves were often cloaked in the language of necessity or responsibility. A widow might sell part of her holdings to provide for her children. A newly married woman might acquire new laborers to establish her household. Friends and relatives might trade individuals as part of larger exchanges, reinforcing ties of kinship while shifting resources. In each case, women were not passive spectators but active participants shaping outcomes to suit their own circumstances. This dynamic also highlights the way social networks functioned as economic networks. Women, who were often excluded from formal business circles, relied on personal relationships to conduct transactions. A letter might carry news of someone available for purchase, or a casual conversation at a gathering might spark a negotiation. Trust played a central role. Deals were often struck between people who already knew one another, where bonds of friendship or family could guarantee the terms. Through these networks, women extended their reach, creating a web of connections that kept them firmly engaged in the commerce of their communities. The domestic setting of many of these deals underscores how normalized they were. A parlor could be both a place of hospitality and a place of commerce. A conversation over sewing or during a visit could shift seamlessly into negotiations about labor. These exchanges were part of the fabric of social life, unremarkable to those who participated in them but significant in their consequences. Looking back, what emerges is a portrait of women who were far from removed from the systems of their time. They exercised judgment, navigated choices, and asserted authority in ways that history has often overlooked. Their roles in these exchanges complicate the narrative of women as purely sheltered or detached figures. Instead, they reveal women as active agents who use the tools available to them, family ties, social networks, and domestic spaces, to engage in the commerce that underpinned their society. It is important to recognize that these decisions were not abstract. Each choice shaped lives and altered destinies. The women who conducted these transactions were not simply moving numbers in a ledger, they were reshaping households, communities, and futures. And in doing so, they left behind records that testify to their involvement, their decision-making, and their sense of authority. The history of these transactions reminds us that influence does not always announce itself in loud, public gestures. Sometimes, it takes place quietly, over tea or in the corner of a parlor. Sometimes it is carried out through letters passed between sisters, or whispered conversations among friends. Yet these quiet decisions carried weight, shaping the contours of lives and the structure of society. To uncover this part of the past is to see how deeply women were woven into the economic fabric of their world. They were not merely bystanders but participants, using their homes and networks as platforms for decisions that reverberated far beyond the walls of their parlors. Their actions remind us that history is not only made in the halls of politics or the fields of battle, it is also made in the intimate, everyday spaces where choices are made and power is quietly exercised. In the households of the South, behind the polished furniture and carefully tended gardens, there existed a reality often left out of polite conversation. It was a world where black women bore burdens that went far beyond the endless physical labor expected of them. Their bodies were not only instruments of work but also resources to be managed, controlled, and used to serve the interests of others. This was not simply about tending fields or cooking meals, it was about the most intimate parts of life, from nurturing infants to being denied the right to make choices about their own families. One of the most common and heartbreaking roles forced upon them was that of wet nursing. Imagine a young black mother, her own child left hungry or in the care of someone else, because she was commanded to provide nourishment for the infant of the household. Her milk, meant for her own baby, became a resource redirected to uphold the comfort and survival of another family. This practice was framed as a necessity for the white household, but for the women forced into it, it meant the painful sacrifice of their own children's needs. Generations of mothers endured the anguish of seeing their ability to nurture taken from them and redirected toward children not their own. The intrusion into their lives did not stop there. These women also lived under the weight of reproductive expectations that were never theirs to control. In many households, the birth of a child to an enslaved woman was treated not as the creation of a family, but as an addition to property, an increase in wealth. This transformed the most personal and profound human experience into a cold calculation of gain. The freedom to choose whether, when, or with whom to have children was stripped away, leaving them in a cycle where even their most intimate moments were bound to the interests of others. Worse still, the veil of domestic respectability often hid the exploitation these women endured. Behind closed doors, they faced violations that could never be spoken of openly, yet were tolerated, ignored, or even justified within the system that surrounded them. Their silence was not a choice but a condition imposed by fear, by power, and by the knowledge that resistance could bring brutal consequences. For them, the home was not a sanctuary but a place where they were constantly vulnerable. The pain of this reality stretched beyond individual lives and into entire families. Children were often born into circumstances they did not choose, separated from mothers, or marked by the complicated legacies of power and violation. For the women themselves, the emotional toll was heavy. They were asked to give their strength, their care, and their very bodies, yet were denied the dignity of ownership over their own lives. Still, many found ways to endure, to hold on to fragments of love, resilience, and humanity in a world that tried to reduce them to something less. To tell this story is not simply to recount suffering. It is to recognize the layers of resilience hidden within it. These women, despite the exploitation they endured, carried within them a strength that refused to vanish. They nurtured bonds with their children when they could, whispered lessons of survival, and held on to their identities even when the world around them sought to erase them. Every act of care they managed to give their families was a quiet defiance against the system that tried to control them. Their lives remind us that history is not only written in laws, battles, or speeches. It is also written in the untold experiences of those who lived under the heaviest burdens. The image of a woman forced to nurse another's child, or to carry pregnancies determined by someone else's power, is not just a detail of the past, it is a reflection of how deeply systems of control can reach into the most personal corners of life. When we uncover these stories, we confront the truth of what it meant to live under such conditions. We see how exploitation shaped households, not just through labor in the fields but through the very bodies of the women whose lives were commandeered. We begin to understand that the comforts enjoyed by one group came at the immeasurable cost of another's humanity. This is why it is essential to remember. To speak of these women is to give voice to those who were silenced, to acknowledge the depth of their suffering and the strength of their endurance. Their stories challenge us to think about power, justice, and the legacies that still ripple through our world today. They remind us that the past is not distant, it lingers in memory, in culture, and in the very fabric of society. By shining a light on this hidden chapter, we give honor to lives that were too often ignored. We recognize that within the walls of those households, beneath the polished veneer of Southern gentility, were women who endured unimaginable hardships yet carried forward an unbroken spirit. Their resilience is a testament to survival in the face of overwhelming odds, and their story demands to be told, not in whispers, but in voices loud enough to ensure that history never forgets them. In the quiet drawing rooms and wide verandas of the South, society liked to imagine white women as gentle figures, keepers of the home, soft in manner, and delicate in spirit. But beneath the lace and refinement, there were stories that shattered this image. Some women, entrusted with power inside the household, wielded it with a cruelty so severe that even their husbands, men accustomed to harshness, found themselves compelled to step in. These moments of intervention were not born out of compassion alone. Rather, they revealed a disturbing truth: violence in these households could erupt with such intensity that it unsettled even those who lived by systems built on control. Imagine a scene where a husband, returning home, discovers his wife in the midst of an outburst so extreme that the atmosphere in the room shifts from authority to chaos. The very order he prided himself on maintaining was disrupted not by rebellion, but by the unrestrained anger of his own partner. This is where the myths of Southern womanhood unravel. Society celebrated these women as moral anchors, yet behind closed doors, some became feared figures. Their proximity to the daily lives of enslaved people gave them both opportunity and motive. Unlike men who might spend much of their time outside in fields or in public affairs, women were often present in the intimate rhythms of domestic life. They oversaw meals, clothing, child care, and every detail of household labor. This closeness meant that frustrations, jealousies, or perceived disobedience could spark immediate reaction, and in certain cases, those reactions became terrifying. Accounts from the time describe women who lashed out with objects at hand, whose tempers escalated far beyond scolding. Theirs was not the distant authority of an overseer but the sharp, intimate cruelty of someone who lived among those she controlled every hour of the day. And when this violence exceeded what even their husbands found acceptable, it was not because they disapproved of the system itself, but because unchecked rage threatened to destabilize the image of order that held the household together. It is important to see this not as isolated behavior, but as part of the broader reality of power within those homes. The position of a white woman in that society was complicated. She lived under laws that gave her fewer rights than her husband, yet within the home, she exercised near total control over the lives of others. That mixture of limitation and authority sometimes boiled over into acts of domination that blurred the line between discipline and destruction. And when a husband intervened, it was less about justice than about maintaining balance, keeping cruelty within the bounds of what was considered acceptable. Stories of these women remind us how power can shape behavior in unpredictable ways. While history often frames them as passive participants in the system around them, moments like these reveal how actively some engaged in upholding and even intensifying it. Their violence was not an accident but an expression of the authority they had been taught to wield from girlhood, carried to its harshest extremes. For the enslaved people in their charge, such volatility meant that danger was never far away. They lived under a system that was already harsh, and in households with women known for their violent tempers, daily life could become a landscape of fear. A wrong glance, a delay in completing a task, even the perception of disrespect could trigger unpredictable punishment. The unpredictability itself was a form of control, keeping those around them constantly on edge. And yet, these stories also reveal something about the husbands who intervened. Their actions did not dismantle the system, they reinforced it by trying to manage the image of control. They wanted to appear as steady masters of their households, and unchecked rage, especially from their wives, threatened that appearance. By restraining violence that spiraled too far, they were not offering protection to the vulnerable, but rather ensuring that the performance of order remained intact. Looking back, these accounts tear away the facade of refinement that history often places on the women of the South. They were not merely passive ornaments of society, standing in the shadows of their husbands. They were active participants, sometimes even feared enforcers, shaping the lives of those around them with choices that could be as harsh and unforgiving as any made by men. To remember this is to challenge the comforting myths of the past. It forces us to see that violence did not come only from overseers in the fields or from masters conducting business. It also came from the women within the home, women whose actions could be so extreme that even their husbands, men accustomed to brutality, felt the need to intervene. These are difficult stories, but they matter. They remind us that power, once granted, can be twisted in ways that defy expectation. They show us that behind the polished image of gentility, there were undercurrents of rage and cruelty that shaped daily life. And they force us to recognize that the legacy of this system cannot be understood if we look only at one half of the story. Women, too, played a role, sometimes with a hand so heavy that even those beside them recoiled. When the cannons fell silent and the Civil War came to an end, the South entered a new and uncertain chapter. Plantations once bustling with forced labor stood eerily quiet, and the system that had sustained entire households for generations collapsed almost overnight. For many white families, especially women who had tied their identity and security to the people they owned, the war's end felt like the unraveling of their entire world. But the story did not simply end there. These women did not quietly surrender their hold on wealth and power. Instead, they fought to salvage what they could, often through desperate and calculated means. Some chose flight over surrender. As the Union Army advanced, women packed up their belongings and moved the enslaved men, women, and children in their possession deeper into the South, trying to keep them out of reach of freedom. Caravans of wagons rolled down dusty roads, carrying not just furniture or silver, but entire families forced to march in chains. These journeys revealed the extent to which women, just as much as men, were invested in preserving the system. They refused to see its end as inevitable, clinging to the belief that they could outlast the war by hiding their wealth in human form. Others turned to the courts and the government, demanding restitution. They argued that emancipation had robbed them of property, and in doing so, of their rightful inheritance. Some wrote petitions filled with the language of grievance, claiming loss and victimhood. What they sought was not justice, but payment for the lives they once controlled. These claims were framed as rational, even moral in their eyes, as though the years of forced labor had not already yielded untold wealth for their households. By appealing for compensation, they exposed how deeply entitlement was rooted in their sense of identity. But perhaps the most chilling strategy lay in what came after legal emancipation. Freedom had been declared, but many white women, determined not to lose their accustomed way of life, devised ways to bind the newly freed into systems that looked strikingly familiar to the past. Apprenticeships, often justified as teaching trades or providing structure for children, became a tool of exploitation. Young boys and girls, newly freed yet still vulnerable, were forced back into labor under contracts signed without real consent. Women used these agreements to keep control over the very same people who were supposed to be free, ensuring that the rhythms of work in kitchens and fields changed little despite the end of slavery and law. Behind each of these strategies was fear of economic ruin, fear of losing social status, fear of confronting a future where the old order no longer guaranteed their place. For generations, white women in the South had drawn their sense of power not from public life or politics, but from the ownership and management of enslaved people within their homes. With that system torn away, they faced an identity crisis. Instead of adapting, many clung harder to what had been, using every possible method to maintain their sense of dominance. The irony of this struggle is striking. Though often depicted as victims of a war they did not start, these women revealed through their actions just how deeply invested they were in its cause. They were not passive bystanders swept up in change, they were active agents working to preserve systems of exploitation in any form they could. Their petitions, their relocations, their contracts, all of it speaks to an unwillingness to imagine a world where their wealth and power did not rest on the control of others. For the freed people, this meant that freedom came with heavy chains of its own. While the law declared them no longer enslaved, the practices of women determined to protect their privilege ensured that life after the war was marked by struggle. Young children apprenticed without choice, adults forced into exploitative labor arrangements, and families torn apart once again by relocation, all carried the weight of a system that refused to die quietly. These stories complicate the way we think about the aftermath of the Civil War. They show us that the end of slavery was not a clean break, not a moment where justice simply replaced injustice. Instead, it was a contested space, where old power refused to vanish and new lives had to be fought for at every step. White women, far from being symbols of fragility in this era, emerged as determined defenders of the old ways, willing to bend laws and exploit loopholes to keep their grasp intact. To understand this period is to recognize that emancipation was both a victory and a beginning of new battles. The determination of women to salvage their wealth reminds us that systems of inequality do not dissolve with the stroke of a pen. They linger, reshaping themselves through the people most invested in their survival. And in the South, that meant women as much as men. This chapter of history asks us to look more closely, to see not just the broad strokes of war and freedom, but the small, calculated decisions made in homes and courtrooms. Decisions that reveal how far some were willing to go to preserve privilege, even as the world around them demanded change. When the guns of the Civil War fell silent and freedom was declared, a new dawn seemed to rise over the South. For the first time, those who had lived under generations of forced labor could imagine lives shaped by their own choices. Yet as quickly as the promise of freedom spread, powerful forces moved to dim that light. In courtrooms, in legislatures, and in the daily practices of communities, new systems were crafted that echoed the old order in chilling ways. They bore new names, black codes, convict leasing, vagrancy laws, but their purpose was unmistakable, to keep the same hands in power, and to ensure that those once enslaved remained trapped in cycles of labor and control. The black codes emerged first, passed by Southern legislatures in the immediate aftermath of the war. Written in language that seemed neutral, these laws placed harsh restrictions on the lives of newly freed people. They dictated where they could live, the kinds of work they could do, and even how they could move through towns. A man without papers proving employment could be fined or arrested simply for walking a road. To the freed community, these codes felt like shackles forged from ink and parchment, replacing the chains that had only just been broken. Soon after, another system took shape, convict leasing. It began with a simple equation: the South had lost its labor force, prisons were filling rapidly, and state governments were eager for revenue. By criminalizing everyday behaviors, from gathering in groups to seeking new employment, officials could ensure a steady supply of prisoners. These individuals, disproportionately black, were then leased out to private companies, farms, and industries. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners toiled in fields and mines, often treated worse than they had been under slavery, since lessees had no long-term investment in their survival. For those trapped in this system, freedom had proved a hollow promise. Vagrancy laws added yet another layer. They targeted the most vulnerable, those without steady work or permanent homes. Being poor, or even appearing idle, could result in arrest. Once convicted, individuals could be fined sums they could never afford, and when they failed to pay, they were pushed into forced labor to repay their debt. These laws transformed poverty itself into a crime, ensuring that those who had just escaped enslavement remained under constant threat of being swept back into servitude under another name. For white elites, these systems provided more than labor. They offered reassurance. The end of slavery had upended the social order, raising questions about status, wealth, and identity. But through these new laws, many could cling to the familiar. The fields continued to be worked, industries thrived on cheap labor, and hierarchies remained intact. Even women, often excluded from politics and business at the highest levels, found ways to benefit. They hired labor through the convict system, managed households that relied on workers bound by vagrancy laws, and maintained the domestic order that had defined their place in society before the war. In this way, they too became invested in the perpetuation of systems that preserved their comfort at the expense of others' freedom. Stories from this time reveal the harsh realities. Men taken from their families for the smallest infractions, children apprenticed under exploitative contracts, women forced to labor in homes and fields as if emancipation had never occurred. The names were different, the laws cloaked in legal language, but the result was hauntingly familiar, a system designed to control bodies and extract labor, while insulating those in power from change. The resilience of these systems underscores a larger truth about history: oppression often adapts. When one form is struck down, another rises, crafted to fit the new age yet serving the same purpose. The South, reeling from defeat, rebuilt itself not only with bricks and mortar but with laws and practices that ensured freedom would always be conditional, always fragile for those at the bottom of the hierarchy. For those who lived through it, the struggle for real freedom became a daily battle, fought not only against overt hostility but against the invisible bars of legislation and policy. Yet within this bleak landscape, communities resisted. Families moved in search of fairer opportunities, churches became places of organization, and voices rose to challenge the injustices dressed in the clothing of law. Their persistence reminds us that even when systems bend toward exploitation, the human will to seek dignity does not vanish. Looking back, it becomes clear that the period after the Civil War was not just about rebuilding the South's economy or infrastructure, it was about rebuilding its systems of control. Black codes, convict leasing, vagrancy laws, these were not accidents of history, but deliberate choices by those unwilling to relinquish power. They were designed to preserve privilege under a new guise, ensuring that the story of the South remained one of inequality despite the promise of freedom. This chapter forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how societies adapt to protect old hierarchies. It shows us that freedom is never simply given, it must be defended, nurtured, and secured against the constant reinvention of oppression. The past whispers to us through these laws, reminding us that the struggle did not end with emancipation. It continued in courtrooms, in prisons, in households, and in the quiet determination of those who refused to be silenced. As the story of the South unfolds, it becomes clear that the role of white women cannot be brushed aside as mere background. Too often, history paints them as passive figures, gentle daughters, dutiful wives, or reluctant inheritors of a cruel institution. Yet the truth runs far deeper. They were not simply present within a system of oppression, they were active agents who shaped it, sustained it, and passed it forward into generations that followed. Their hands, just as much as men's, guided the structures of labor, authority, and hierarchy that defined both slavery and its aftermath. Within homes, they trained children to see human beings as property. In marketplaces and social gatherings, they arranged sales and transfers of people as if they were transactions no different than trading goods. Through the language they used, the decisions they made, and the values they upheld, they reinforced the very hierarchies that divided communities by race and status. Even after emancipation, their voices did not fall silent. They fought to protect their wealth, to preserve their households, and to mold the new systems that emerged in the place of slavery. Laws, customs, and unwritten rules continued to echo with their influence, ensuring that the promise of freedom for the formerly enslaved was entangled with new barriers at every turn. Stories from this period show us women who were not merely watching events unfold but stepping into roles of power, sometimes quietly, through social expectations, and other times with startling force. Their presence in the story of the South is not a footnote but a central chapter, one that complicates how we think about gender, privilege, and responsibility. To recognize this is not to condemn every individual but to confront the reality that the system itself thrived because so many upheld it, regardless of gender. This truth reshapes the way we remember history. It challenges the comforting idea that one group alone carried the weight of wrongdoing, and instead forces us to see how entire communities, families, and networks contributed to the endurance of oppression. White women, bound by their own search for identity and influence, found in slavery and its aftermath a tool to secure their place in society. And in doing so, they ensured that the racial hierarchy would not vanish with emancipation but linger in laws, customs, and everyday practices long into the future. As we reflect on this legacy, we are reminded that history is not static. It is made and remade by people, by choices, by the quiet acts of daily life as much as by great battles and proclamations. The actions of white women in the age of slavery and beyond illustrate how deeply woven oppression can become, when normalized within households, justified in communities, and defended even when the world shifts toward change. To tell this story is not to dwell in darkness, but to bring clarity to the past so that its shadows do not fall unnoticed over the present. By uncovering these hidden roles, we see more fully how systems of inequality endure, and how they can be challenged when truth is faced with honesty. It is only by naming these realities that we move closer to understanding not just what happened, but how it continues to shape the world around us. The lives of those who endured slavery deserve more than silence, and the actions of those who upheld it demand recognition. To acknowledge that white women were not passive, but active participants, is to take one more step toward telling history as it truly was. It is a reminder that responsibility stretches across boundaries of gender and status, and that the pursuit of justice begins with truth. If you found this journey into the hidden layers of history meaningful, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so that these untold stories can reach more people. Thank you for staying with me through this chapter, and as always, I wish you a peaceful night and a good rest.